How to Resolve Inner Conflict, Carl Jung, Psychosynthesis, and Working with Subpersonalities. In this video, I'm going to tell you just a little bit about the Jungian, or we could say psychosynthetic therapy tradition, and I'm going to show you a technique that I think encapsulates the therapeutic wisdom of that tradition. Now, Carl Jung was an associate of Freud's, but ended up breaking with Freud. Sigmund Freud was thinking of himself as a scientist, and Carl Jung was really essentially a spiritualist. Okay, an interesting thing about Jung that not many people realize is that early in his career, he wrote and published what amounts to a religious gospel text called the Seven Sermons to the Dead. And it's pretty far out stuff. Later in his career, he was a little regretful about having published this, not because he had any trouble with its content, but he just considered it to be professionally unwise. But in any event, Carl Jung one time wrote a letter to Freud. This is when they were still in a relationship with one another, and they would exchange letters, which I guess the two men kept these letters because we can read them now. And there's a very interesting letter where Carl Jung is writing to Freud and says, hey, I was thinking, might it not make more sense for us to call what we are doing with patients, instead of psychoanalysis, psychosynthesis? And Freud, obviously wasn't interested in this idea, and that might have been the last we really heard of that term from Carl Jung. But interestingly, a man who followed in Jung's footsteps named Roberto Assagioli developed a system of therapy, and he was influenced by Jung, and he called that system psychosynthesis. And so if you say psychosynthesis today, people can think you're referring to the method of therapy developed by Roberto Assagioli. But I believe that it actually makes sense as a concept to refer to the part of the broad transpersonal therapy tradition that includes Jung and Assagioli. Okay, now, there's a technique that I think contains the essential practical or therapeutic wisdom of this tradition. There's plenty of ideas of Jung and theory and so on and so forth, but on a practical therapeutic level, there's a technique that I'm going to show you now, and that is very useful at certain times in therapy for resolving certain forms of inner conflict, okay? And I think of it as subpersonality dialogue, but it descends from something that Jung used to do, at least in his personal life, which he called active imagination, okay? And he would kind of create an imaginary landscape and kind of actively move through that imaginary process, okay? Now, people after Jung, Roberto Assagioli being one of them, thought in terms of subpersonalities, in other words, different aspects of the human character that in some ways are like little personalities within the individual psychology. Okay, and then you ended up having different kind of packagings, if you will, of that technique of active imagination. Like there was something called voice dialogue, or more recently, there's a popular form of therapy known as internal family systems. These ideas, by the way, show up in the Pixar movie Inside Out. And there's actually a lot of kind of impressive, sophisticated understandings embedded in that movie. So it's very interesting. But I like to think of it as subpersonality dialogue. And what you can do is you can think in terms of different parts of the self and have them dialogue with one another. Okay, this is where the concept of the child self comes from, by the way. All right. So one way to do it is, to start out by imagining yourself, and I'll guide you through a little imagination now. So the one thing you don't want to be doing while listening to this is driving a car, okay? But if you're in a place where you can listen safely, I'll guide you through a little imaginary process to kind of introduce you to it, and then you can work with the technique on your own. But you imagine yourself sitting maybe under a tree in a field. And now imagine this 5-year-old version of you approaching from the distance. And in your imagination, just notice what that's like. Notice what you feel like seeing this 5-year-old version of you. And as the 5-year-old version of you approaches you, notice how that version of you seems to respond to you. Does that child seem glad to see you? Does that child seem maybe frightened of you? Does the child seem shy? Does the child seem excited? Just notice whatever you notice about your own reactions to the child and the child's reactions to you. As the child comes closer to you in your imagination, notice what that's like. And if you'd like, you can have the child approach you, and you could have the child sit in your lap, or you could have the child come sit near you. And just seeing what that's like, okay? As you notice whatever you notice, just let that be whatever it is. And then when you're ready, you can kind of bring this little experiment to a close and to come back to your normal sense of self. Okay, so that's a little introduction to this type of work. But then what you can do is to apply it to some inner conflict. And that might work like this. Step 1 is formulate the conflict. Okay, what are the two different sides? And you can think of it in terms of part of me wants to do X and part of me wants to do Y. Okay? So just get clear, it's conflict between two paths, and what are the two paths? That's step 1. Then step 2 is, how would you describe the part of you, how would you characterize the part of you that wants to go the one path, and how would you characterize the part of you that feels a different way? Okay? So, sometimes this can show up in the form of there's an adventurer part of you who wants to go on a certain adventure. And then there's a cautious part of you who wants to stay safe, who doesn't want to take too big of a risk. And sometimes that comes up as a conflict, right? And it's a very difficult conflict to resolve when the two parts are, we could say, not talking with one another. It's a little bit like there are these two sections of your brain that don't have sufficient neural pathways between them to resolve the conflict, okay? Now, that itself I'm using really as a metaphor, but subpersonality dialogue can be a psychological way to get those two parts of yourself talking, okay? So once you have clarified what the conflict is, and then characterized each different side, then you can engage in a dialogue. And you might do this in writing. You write a dialogue between these two parts of yourself as if they were two different characters, right? And then you have them talk. And the goal is to reach mutual understanding. You want to have each one listen as well as they can to the other, and also have each one express themselves to the other. Right? At least metaphorically, these are different parts of you. And so they have to live and work together. And so they're going to have to work some things out. And you can write a dialogue as if you were writing a scene in a play. Okay? And you just see where it takes you. Right? It can be a very useful exercise. And sometimes I'll guide clients through this kind of exercise in therapy. Now, the inner adventurer and the inner risk manager, that's one form that this can take. But it could be the inner child and the inner parent, or my 5-year-old self and my 20-year-old self, or my inner warrior versus my inner lover. You just characterize the parts in the way that makes most sense, okay? And then you have them dialogue. Now, sometimes people, when I introduce them to this exercise, say, hey, I feel like this seems a little crazy, like you're turning me into multiple personalities. So it's always important to say, this is just an exercise. You don't have to think in any kind of funny way about consciousness to engage in this exercise. It's just a way to work with material of the psyche that, like I say, can be very powerful and therapeutically useful. All right? So it's something that you can play around with, you can experiment with. And I'll just add, to bring it full circle and back to Carl Jung. Carl Jung, I don't believe, would have thought in terms of the child self or the teenage self or anything like that. Carl Jung, like I said, was a spiritualist, and he was thinking more in terms of archetypes, if you will, mythological aspects of the personality that he saw as existing in the collective psyche, the collective consciousness. Okay, so it's a little bit of a different angle on the issue, but subpersonalities, the child self or teenage self, I think is a little bit better suited to most people in the kind of modern secular personalistic world. But of course, if you're inclined, you can get into a more archetypal or mythological framework with this. But in any event, I wanted to just show you those things and hope you found it interesting. Check out my other videos for more about other therapy traditions and techniques, and I'll be back with more soon.